you very much. So we're excited to be diving into some of the practical ways that we can respond to some of the issues that Gemma highlighted and how class operates within a UK context. And to do that, we're going to look at how working class communities can be characterised. One of the ways they can be characterised, one feature, is that they are hyperlocal. And that hyperlocality shapes the cultural capital of young people and the likelihood of accessing opportunities outside of their community. We're then going to look at how community mapping can be a practical tool that hopefully after today we can all use, enabling churches to identify opportunities for ministry. And then we're going to look at how work in working class communities and multi-class work, which is the ultimate end, is local, contextual and collaborative. But as we start looking at that, I want to start by talking about my amazing young people. I work at Mill Hill East Church in North London, and the other half of my time when I'm not working for Innovista. And we've been doing youth work on our local estate for years and years. So many years that we had a significant anniversary last year. We normally take our young people away in the summer, and it's, for many young people, the only holiday that they get to go on. And I resonate with that. As a kid who grew up in working class council estates in and around Greater Manchester growing up as a kid, I similarly only went on holiday when my church took me away. Because it was a special anniversary, we took our young people to the Isle of Wight. And it was hilarious and chaotic. They had lots of innocent questions. I have not got a passport. Can I possibly go to the Isle of Wight? What time is it here? If I call my mum, will it be the middle of the night? But then they said some things that were probably a little bit more surprising for some of us as well. They'd never seen the sea before. They'd never seen a sheep in real life. In fact, a number of our young people slept terribly because they'd never slept in a bed before. Christians often engage with issues of class through the lens of poverty and deprivation and need. And that's okay, but actually class really shapes our culture and our worldview. And as Gemma said, there is positive and negative attributes to that. How do I tell Jesus' parable of the lost sheep to teenagers who've never seen a sheep? How do I sing the song Oceans to someone who's never seen the sea? How can they conceptualize that and understand the gospel? When we're trying to define what it means to be working class in the UK, there are three common ways of doing it, which hopefully are coming up on the screen now. The first is that we have these social categories. Now, they describe what sort of work people have. They're often used in politics when people are talking about voting groups and demographics and how policies might affect certain people, but they're becoming a little bit dated as work is changing so much. And actually what work looks like in working class communities in coastal areas or inner city estates or post-industrial towns across parts of our country is going to be very different. Another way that people look at class is through income. You might see that graph in the bottom right, and what means someone has, how much they earn. Another way that people look at class is through the lens explicitly of poverty. Bottom left of the screen is the indices of multiple deprivation, a way that people measure poverty in the UK. And they look at the inequality of different things. There can be poverty in areas of health, access to services, educational outcomes, the physical environment that they live in. And yet, there's two challenges with this. If we define class in terms of poverty, well, we don't emphasize what God is doing in amongst their communities, and we don't emphasize the good in those communities, places where we might build upon work. And the other thing is that these descriptions obviously don't fit children and young people, do they? Is it fair to define them by what their parent earns or what job they have? One way that I think we can define working class people, and a way that applies to both adults and children, is that working class communities are often hyper-local. There's been loads of work on this, particularly by the Social Mobility Commission, which is looking at how people might move up and down classes and have opportunities in life. That often highlights that one of the biggest challenges to wealth inequality in the UK, one of the biggest challenges to the levelling up agenda that the government had, or the big society as it had before, or all sorts of other failed projects to work with different classes of people, is that people don't have much geographic mobility. That people from working class communities, they don't travel to pick the best school, they go to the school that's nearest. That people from working class communities are perhaps inhibited by having lower levels of car ownership, by being dependent upon public transport for how they get to places. They have shorter distances for work, for shopping, for education. And interestingly, I think if we start to define class in terms of relation to space and land, I think we do start to get into some of the biblical definitions of status and society and poverty as well, because often whether you worked on the land or owned the land was one of the biggest signifiers of class. This is really pronounced for where children play. Michael Winus is a sociologist at Warwick University, and he wrote a fantastic kind of the Bible on childhood. And in that, he explains that actually across the world, we see in all sorts of different countries that a global feature of childhood for working class communities is that they inhabit a particular space. And that middle class children often travel further for education, for recreation, for socializing. He highlights in that there's a trope that carries across cultures and across time, the trope of a street child. Whether that's Oliver Twist, or whether that's a child with an ASBO in a certain area, whether that's a gang in the projects of America, or someone growing up in a township in South America or South Africa. Whether we think of gangs with certain language or streets that they're named after. Often when we think of children and young people from poorer and working class communities, we think about how they dominate and inhabit a very particular space. And often sometimes can be very fearful to move out of that space. Within education, I'm a school governor of our local community primary school. There is a term that is used to try and address the way that hyperlocality shapes the worldview of young people. They talk about cultural capital. It's a concept that was come up by a French sociologist, actually many years ago. But this concept, particularly of embodied cultural capital, is this concept that the language we use and the way that we interpret the world is shaped by the physical environment and the life experiences that we have. We interpret the world and we express ourselves in light of the language, experiences, and opportunities that we all have. The Canadian missiologist Alan Roxburgh talks about this when he contributes the term language house in some of his work on missiology. That is, we all have in our heads a repository, a bank of language, of life experience. And it's this that we use to interpret the world. We know this. This is a very obvious thing. So when Jesus uses parables, what does he use? He uses the language that people around him knew. He uses metaphors that they understand, metaphors of day labourers going to a vineyard, or people hosting a wedding feast, or a father and his sons. Languages and experience that people have. I think if we reflect on the hyper-local experience, particularly of working class young people, but of how different classes interact with land and space, we start to define young people not in terms of poverty and need negatively, but we start to think about how their life has shaped their culture and their interpretive lens, the worldview through which they see and interact with the world. And we start to think about how we might learn some of those local references and needs in order to communicate with young people. There's a really key story in the life of Jesus where I think we see that he understands this. He understands that place and being in a certain place is really important. And Erica is going to take us through it now.
Hey everyone, good to be here with you. I've got the joy of taking you through a passage in Luke. So if you do have a Bible, or likely a phone, and if your phone won't distract you, I'd encourage you to open up to Luke, and you can have a little flick through with me. And I want to think through some principles that we can apply to reaching predominantly unreached communities. But I just want to frame this first by zooming out, because there are some cracking bits in Luke that are key to our ministry with children, youth, and families. So, starting at Luke chapter 4. Here we see that Jesus is establishing his ministry News about him is spreading as he teaches in the synagogues, and he stops off in his hometown to release his manifesto, one that you probably know well. And this is what he says in verse 18 of chapter 4. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, and to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus has come for the poor, those who are marginalized in society, the outcast, the widow, the oppressed. Not for the comfortable ones that are saying, "Oh, praise you, God, that you didn't make me like that one." He came for the one that knew they had nothing to bring except their brokenness and sin, and they just needed the hope of Jesus. This is where the Lord's harvest is, with people ready to receive Jesus, pouring out what little they have at his feet and wiping away their tears with their hair as they kiss him. Jesus is controversial, and he is divisive. Is he a prophet? Is he a blasphemer? Or is he really God's Messiah, the Savior they'd been waiting for? And as we flick through Luke, Jesus is traveling on his way to Jerusalem. He's going town to town, teaching and performing miracles. And whilst he's wowing the crowd with his incredible words and his authority, he's also making disciples. He's training up a core of chosen 12 and others that he's scooped up along the way. And it's really exciting to be with Jesus. Can you imagine? How cool would that be to be with the guy who's doing these incredible miracles? But Jesus doesn't allow his followers to believe it's all about the glory. And in chapter 9, if you just want to flick forward with me, he tells them about the suffering that he will face. And he calls them too to take up their cross daily as they follow him. Ministry, we know, is costly. Jesus' followers are told that they have to leave behind the life they have always known, even forsaking their family responsibilities, to be focused on where he is sending them. With Jesus, you have to be all in. And this takes us to Luke chapter 10. So Jesus is preparing them for his departure. And get this, let's just pause for a minute. So we've got God here in human form. He's blatantly the best placed to grow his church. And yet he decides that after a mere 3 years, he's going to step aside and leave it to us, to ordinary people like you and me, with all our faults and our flaws and the mistakes that we're bound to make. And he can do this because actually we're not alone. It is his power that we're doing it, and it is his harvest, not ours. Isn't that an encouragement? So let's jump into this passage in Luke chapter 10. And it says here in verse 1, "After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field.'" Now, at this point, Jesus had already sent out his core team, and he's now expanding the mission to the people even less qualified to do this work. These are the people that whilst he's having his chat with his bros, they're on the outside craning their necks trying to listen in, these 72. And he tells them to go in expectation that they will find a harvest. But there just aren't enough workers to gather in the crop. Now, I don't know what your experience of ministry is, but for 8 years, I was a youth worker in a Cotswold town. And you know what? It was really tough. It was voted one of the most idyllic places in Europe to visit. It was absolutely beautiful. Whenever I'd go away for a while, I'd come back and drive in, and I'd think, this is flipping crazy. I live in such a beautiful place. Pubs on every corner, lovely little shops. There were millionaires' homes lining the street, and the church had a lot of money and resource. That wasn't the problem. But it was hard for people to see their need for Jesus because they'd already sorted out their needs themselves, or so they thought. And this experience was in comparison to driving a few miles down the road and living on a council estate where 1 in 4 children were in poverty. And that is the place I found the harvest. That is the place where you had to have people on the doors of church because people just wanted to come in. They wanted to engage. You could meet them in the street and they were interested in the hope that you had. Now, they may call God some names that I'm not going to repeat here, but they were ready to engage. So Jesus sends these 72 ahead of him to prepare the way, and they went out in expectation to find people that are ready to receive Jesus. But not only is Jesus sending out ordinary people, the extras that have been tagging along, he's also sending them with nothing. Nothing in their backpack, no food, no essential items, just full dependence on God. He says in verse 3, "Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves." He doesn't even try to sugarcoat it and say you'll probably have a great time. He says it's gonna be tough, and don't take anything with you as well. Jesus is real with them. And if they're rejected, because it will be costly, it's not them being rejected, it is him. And woe to those people. He says to sacrifice their worldly comforts, put aside the worldly tools that they have gathered. Think about the ones that we take with us as we go into children, youth, and families ministry. Those tried and tested ministry tools, those programs that worked over there, they must work over here too, right? Well, they can at times be helpful, but ultimately what we need is God, a dependence, a full dependence on him. And he said to focus. Do not greet anyone on your way. Now, there must have been so many shiny distractions as they walked that road. So many people they could stop and tell about Jesus. Now, I moved to my community in Cornwall 2 years ago. My family and I chose to go to a place where there was poverty, there's social housing there, higher crime rates, and a low-achieving school. And churches over the years have made an effort to engage. They've knocked on doors, they've invited people to events, they've loved them with toddler groups and food banks. But opportunities for discipleship is lacking. In the 1,688 social housing dwellings in my city, few are represented in the pews on a Sunday, in particular, children, youth, and families. And my family and I went to be a part of a church that's on the edge of our estate with clear intentions. We'd come to reach those that are unreached. And when I shared my heart with the church, they said, well, that's admirable. Well done. But actually, there's no money in it. And you won't have much resource. And we just can't commit to that. And instead, I was offered a shiny role to join a new city centre church in a trendy venue where I could be on stage with good coffee and a new sound system. And I had to say no to that security and that nice coffee. So many distractions, money, comfort, friends, and family, or a call to go and focus on where we're being sent as lambs among wolves. And it says in verse 5, when you enter a house, say peace to this house. If someone who promotes peace is there, your peace will rest on them. If not, it will return to you. Stay there eating and drinking, whatever they give you, for the worker deserves his wages. Do not move from house to house. And when you enter a town and are welcomed, eat what is offered to you. Heal the sick who are there and tell them the kingdom of God has come near. As the 72 went, dependent on God, his provision came in surprising ways. He provided through the very people they had gone to serve. And you can see in these verses a partnership as people of peace enable these followers to bring the message of the kingdom. Now, I've intentionally lived on council estates for the past 7 or 8 years, and I first went as a young mum thinking, I've got my youth and families degree, I've got my team, I've got a title, surely that gives me some significance in a conversation with people. And you know what? It broke me multiple times because I was leaning on my strength and not on my dependence of God. And in my brokenness, I found God's love and his provision not necessarily in the church that had put me there. I found it in my neighbors. My neighbor was the first person to invite me over for coffee when we moved into our community. And I was desperately lonely. We moved in a pandemic. I hadn't even been to church because it wasn't open. And yet it was a mum at the local school that said, please come over. I'd love to hang out with you. I found the best friendship. People that have loved me, that have been generous to me. And those are the ones I thought I came to serve them. God shows up in surprising places. And I just want to look with this in mind and thinking about that hyper-locality of these communities. What are some principles that you can apply? So I'm going to get you to think about where you're coming from now. How can we make ministry accessible to all? So, multi-class ministry that is for everyone, is local. So I want you first to think about a place near you, a place where the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. First, relationship is really important in these cultures. Isn't that wonderful? Gemma was saying before that there are things that we need to affirm and learn from in working class communities. Just because you show up with a degree and a title, apparently, that doesn't get you an invite to someone's house. Trust takes time to build. It can't be assumed. So we have to think about how can we join in to local activities in that community? What's already going on that we can celebrate? What new activity can you learn and get involved in? Maybe bingo? Is that controversial? Maybe an exercise class? Maybe a knitting group with the grandmas. Wouldn't they love that if you showed up there instead of bringing your program to them? Where are their safe spaces where they already are? How can you join in and build a relationship? I remember when I was a youth worker on an estate, the young people were talking about, I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. And to be honest, I don't really like that show. Don't really want to watch it. It's a bit gross, isn't it? But I said, why don't you come over, let's get some food and we'll watch it together. So we can do things that aren't out of our comfort zone, not quite what we'd like to do on a Friday night, but meeting them where they're at. The best way, I would say, is to build relationships through neighbors. If you move to a community, you're showing, I'm committed to you. I'm a part of this community. I care about this community because I live here too. I care about community spaces. I care about the derelict centre that is threatened to being knocked down. I care that there's nothing for young people to do. And the best relationships I have in my community are the people on my street because I see them daily. The kids play together out the front. They all go to the same school, and it's wonderful. But also, we need to think about long-term commitment. You can't go in and out. I don't know what the average youth worker's lifespan is. It's probably shocking and sad. Yeah, it's hard to stick it out. And yet, we have someone like Chris Lane up in Salford. He wrote a book called Ordinary Miracles. And he said, looking back now, 18 years on this estate is a tiny amount of time. It seemed such a huge commitment to make, such a sacrifice for the Lord, but the reality is that in an inner city, after 5 years, you are only just beginning to scratch the surface of all that could be done. After 10, you're starting to see some fruit. What a challenge to be committed to a costly ministry for that long, and the sacrifices we have to make. And also, as you listen to the community and get to know them, as you build a relationship, you can start to bring people together. But thinking about community spaces, where do they have ownership? It might be easy and free to use your church hall, but do they feel welcome there? Is that really emotionally safe for them? Will they walk through those doors? What are the community spaces already available? And then think about detached work. So if you want to find some children or young people, go out of your house, get out from behind your computer screen and out of your resources book. Those are good, but we won't find young people in there. You walk outside and you're bound to find children on the street. That is where you can meet people. That is their turf. where there's equality to be found. Josh's going to share with us 2 more principles.
So we're going to carry on our 101 of how we reach children, young people and families, thinking about this whole context of hyperlocality. And the second thing we're going to look at is that the work has to be contextual. That's a word that's used a lot, but we're going to unpack it in a specific way. Jesus tells his disciples when he sends them out, don't take anything with you. And obviously his emphasis there is on material things. But I wonder what we take into other cultures. I wonder what dependencies we have. Maybe they're programs or preconceptions or ways of doing things. And actually we need to truly inhabit the places where we go in order to communicate to them. The first way that we can make what we do contextual is by thinking about language. There's that maxim, isn't there, that language is the outer skin of culture. And we spoke earlier about those 2 concepts of language houses and cultural capital, the way that the places, the people, the history of an area shape how someone is able to understand and express the world that they're in. Now, this is not just, and I'm sure as anyone who's had any experience of children's and youth work, this is not just about learning the right slang or coming a cropper when you say the wrong thing, or your young people laughing at you for not understanding when they're talking about things. Maybe it's just me who's had that experience. Maybe you're much cooler than I am. But this is about storytelling using the reference points that people have within their culture and their experience. One thing that we found in North London, there is a big issue with gangs and county lines and young people being given money by older young people to go and sell drugs in different areas. They talk a lot about youngers and olders and who's your older. And an older is often someone who's a gang member who is exploiting them. Well, we found in that an image that really resonates is not Jesus as saviour, as king, as quite abstract theological concepts, but the concept of Jesus as the older brother. The Jesus as a compassionate older brother who loves us and wants the best for us and doesn't just want to exploit us to do things for him, but actually wants to see us fulfill the plans and purposes that God has for our lives. If language is the outer skin of culture, food is the literal flavour of culture, isn't it? A lot of our discipleship in church has been centred on house groups. But lots of people who've done work in working class communities will reflect that that is a struggle, that it doesn't quite work in the same way. That for a middle class family, hospitality looks like a 3-course meal and a fire pit. Yet for working class people, it's a takeaway while the boxing is on. We had a huge event for the Euros. We had the Euro finals and all of our community came in. Lots of the pubs have all been turned into flats where we are in North London with all the dense development that's been happening. And we bought loads of beer. Sorry if that's, I don't know if that's okay to say with our Methodist roots here, but we bought lots of beer for the community as we were going to celebrate and watch the Euro final together. And not a single bottle of beer was touched. They all brought rum. There was loads of people who were Jamaican or had lots of friends who were Jamaican, and they much more wanted to drink Wray and Nephews than Budweiser, and that was their culture. We've got to think about this. Sometimes we have models for discipleship that don't quite connect with people's experience. And actually what happens is when we try and offer hospitality that is so alien, well, it does the opposite of what we want it to. And it makes people feel excluded and like they don't know what to do and they don't belong and they don't know how to fit in. So we've got to really think about these things. Another thing that we have to think of is behaviour. People's expectations when they work in different communities can not quite connect with the people that they're working with. A big thing that lots of people who do work in working class communities will reflect on is time. That it is a middle class value to be punctual. But it's a working class value to think about the people that you're with. And if you're on the way to the youth group and you see your auntie or you see someone from school, it would be terrible to ignore that person just because you're running late. That person is more important. That's not negative that working class people maybe turn up late or a bit more chaotic in their attendance to things. They value presence over punctuality. And there's some things to affirm in that, but there's also things we have to work around with that. Because discipleship is not going to happen over a 12-week course on a Wednesday night at a certain time. In fact, even committing to something for 12 weeks probably feels quite intimidating for people whose lives at times can be quite chaotic and they don't have the agency over their time that they might like. But actually, discipleship might happen at the shops. Discipleship might happen in the streets or at the park or at the school gate. And it's about being alive and present to those opportunities. I think the last thing I'd say when we're thinking about being contextual in our work is we have to think about inclusivity. I think there's two elements to this. The first is, in more middle-class churches, we can often stratify the work that we do, particularly children's and youth work, on different ages. And yet, when you walk out into social housing areas, kids roam in gangs based upon who lives in their block. Not literal gangs, just friendship groups. Their friendship groups are shaped by the local area, not by what age or level of schooling they're at. So we've often found, in our youth groups that actually there are younger brothers and sisters who want to come at the same time, who want to be dropped off at the same time. That actually sometimes the best way of reaching parents is when they've come to do drop-off with the kids and actually they're lonely and they want to stay around and chat. And how can we interact with them at the same time as trying to run a program that runs for these young people? That can be a real challenge, right? Because you're trying to create programs and communicate the gospel at age-appropriate levels, but actually that's also something really rich, that when we really start to embrace that, we can reach whole families and communities with the gospel. Another thing is accessibility. We have to think about people's response to and experience of education, maybe people's reading levels, whether they're literate or not. Did Jesus really die that we might go to endless Bible studies? And if he did, what does that do to you if your reading age is of an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old and you can't work through some of the complex language that we have? I'm not sure there's necessarily an easy answer, but maybe we just need to think about how we make it accessible. The main Bible that we use in our church is not the one that we've managed to finesse, whether they're using the right Greek text underneath and whether they've got a dynamic or a literal translation, but it's the one that's easiest to read. We use the New International Reader's Version because we're sensitive to those things. In my particular context, that's because also we have lots of people where English is a second or other language, because in working class communities we'll find higher numbers of asylum seekers and refugees. So that's going to be a big factor. We also see in working class communities much higher levels of disability. So how are we including and making spaces where people can come with mental health issues? What does it do to someone who has anxiety to walk into a big crowd with loud music and flashing lights and it's something they've never experienced before? They just turn around and walk away. And we have to think about how we engage with that. We took our young people away to a youth festival in the summer, and we were so excited to get them there. These are kids who'd never been to church before, and we're like, can't wait for them to experience worship. When I was growing up in Manchester with an older brother who was obsessed with Oasis and listening to Manchester bands, when I first went to church and heard a band, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Our young people hated it. They hated the drums. They'd never heard live music before. They'd never listened to music at that volume before. They just heard tinny rap on their phones, and that was their expectation of music, and it was so uncomfortable for them. And we had to really reflect on how do we make worship that is inclusive of a very different culture. Some of that is about helping them learn new experiences, but a lot of that is also about meeting them where they are. So multi-class ministry has to be contextual. It also has to be collaborative. We often think about dependency when we're working in communities that are disadvantaged. And we often are trying to avoid dependency, when actually we should embrace it. But not people having dependency on us as the workers, but us having dependency on them, on giving people responsibility, on respecting their dignity and gifts that they have. Lots of overseas mission work has started to move from models of development to models of development from models of aid. And yet, in the UK, I think the church has been quite slow on reflecting on concepts like asset-based community development. What does the community have? What is there to celebrate here? What can I join in with? What partnerships are in an area? What other churches can I work with? People are shaped by their local area, not by which denomination and tradition and history your church has. That is going to be a feature within working class communities. What charities, what are the council's aims for your area? What are the challenges that the police are facing? There are opportunities for partnership in the work. What resources do we have? How are we going to resource? There's lots of talk about self-sustainability in mission. And that's good, and that's probably a good principle. But it also is quite a middle-class principle to think about self-sustainability and having enough resources and saving for a rainy day. And in reality, a lot of disadvantaged and deprived communities might never reach the point of self-sustainability. And that doesn't mean they're any less deserving of the gospel. So how are we going to fund that? Can there be more partnerships between churches from different areas? Is that part of how we really celebrate multi-class church, by partnering perhaps churches in more middle-class areas with churches in more working-class areas? Thinking about buildings, Erica started to highlight some of that, some of the ways that people might feel comfortable in different buildings, or actually your building might be the community asset in your area and a place where people can gather. A really key thing is thinking about local leadership. What does a leader look like? Is a leader an educator? Or can a leader be someone who is fantastic at hospitality and talking to people? These are biblical definitions of leadership, to think about people who have gifts of help and mercy and love and grace and pastoral care. So can we find the people of peace, as Jesus talks about here? Can we find new Christians who could be emboldened and empowered? Where were the disciples? Where were the 72 at on this journey? Had they done their catechisms and their classes? Had they been baptized yet? The context isn't there because Jesus, his model of discipleship was radical empowerment and including people and collaborating in his mission. And maybe we could do the same a little bit more in our working class communities. Erica's going to bring us some questions for reflection.
I'm not sure I know how to use this, so bear with me. As I said earlier, I want you to start thinking about where you are. You're bound to be near an area that is underreached. Or perhaps you are reaching an area, but we could always improve on the ministry that we're doing. I just want you to have a couple moments of reflection. We're going to do some self-reflection. Some of you are going to hate this because I'm going to ask you to be quiet and think in your head. If you're on your own, you can just talk to yourself or speak to someone in your house. You might want to grab a piece of paper and a pen if you find that helpful. But just think about, where near you is the harvest plentiful, but the workers few? Where's the place that the church says, that's a great idea, but actually, there's no money in it. We can't really resource that. If you've got that place in mind, think about, where would you start? If you're not already reaching that place, if you're not already living there, how do you start to build connections there? Or perhaps you're already connecting with a community that's underreached and under-resourced. Are there ways you could improve your connections, strengthen your relationship? Could you take more time to just be with people? Could you take more time away from your computer screen, away from your planning, away from your meetings, and go out on the street and knock on some doors? When I was working for a youth organization, partnered with a local church, we had a lot of programs. We had a lot of funding from the council. We had made commitments. A lot of my time was planning. And sometimes there might have been a safeguarding issue. There might have been a reason I had to go around to someone's house to get a form signed. Those times of unexpected interaction, they didn't know I was showing up. They were the best times. And I'd always leave their house thinking, this is what I should be doing. I need to be hanging out with these parents. I need to be going into where the young people live and seeing their context and seeing the dynamics. How can we do more of that? And then, what are the opportunities for partnership? Who's already doing God's work there? Who are the people that are generous, that are passionate about where they live? Who has resources that the church doesn't have, but they'd be willing to share? Now, you may find this a challenge if you're not actively involved in a community like we're describing. So I want to equip you with a tool that you can take away to your church team. This involves you getting out there, by the way, and engaging with some people. So this is community mapping. It's a tool that we use when we partner with churches to help them develop mission in their area. And community mapping helps us to understand unique cultures and rhythms of life in a community, and they differ across the country. Not one estate is the same as another. Josh and I work in very different places. Josh is in London, and I just went to visit his church and his home for the first time yesterday. And I was like, this feels really different to Cornwall, where I live. But Cornwall is the poorest county in England. There's poverty there that isn't really seen or known. So, when you think about community mapping, the people, who actually lives there? What are the demographics? Here's just a few things you can think about, and I want us to think particularly now on the last one. Josh already mentioned the multiple indices of deprivation. You can just Google that and waste lots of time looking up figures and facts. Which one of these are significant, particularly for young people, children, and families where you are? And just now, I want you to think about the gatekeepers in the community. Who are the people that are known, that are respected? Now, these could be people like head teachers, maybe not. These could be social workers, maybe not. These could be shopkeepers. These could be mums that all the children are scared of, but they still choose to hang out at her house. Who are the gatekeepers in the community? And do you know their names? I'm just going to give you a minute to think about that. I hope you're already thinking, I need to make some phone calls or send some emails after this. I need to get to know their names. I need to go out on the street. Second thing you can think about in community mapping is place. Starting with what is it actually like? If you don't live there and you have no reason to go there on a regular basis, it might be worth having a look at a map on your phone now. What are the physical features in that place that make it a community? Where are the parks? Where are the shops? And even better, community mapping is done with people from that community, and you can ask them, where are the significant places for them? Because we can make all sorts of assumptions. My assumption would be young people are at the park. That's where I'll find them. And I go to the park to do detached work, and there's no one there because they're all at someone's house playing video games, because the significant place for them is that mum who's kind of scary, but she feeds them and lets everyone hang out and smoke in her house. So you can ask them, where are significant places? And where are the places they avoid that we might decide is a really good practical place to do our youth and children's work, but they're like, I'd never go there. And right now, I just want to give you a few minutes to think about where people gather. And if you don't live there and you don't go there, I doubt you know the answer to this. But where might people gather? Where are opportunities for informal discipleship that Josh talked about? In my community, the school gates are a great place, because parents just want to hang out there. Like Josh said, they don't want to go back home. They want to make the most of that social time. What can you do with that? How can you create more opportunities to get alongside people? I'd really recommend prayer walking. Me and my husband did it. He'd never done it before, and he was like, why are you talking to me? I thought we were supposed to walk along silently. So you can do it in different ways, whatever floats your boat. But it's a great opportunity because it's never wasted time to go out and pray Pray a blessing on the place. Observe, listen, stop and chat to the lady at the bus stop. You never know what God might do through those interactions. And then we can think about rhythms and values. So if you know who lives there, the demographics, what are their traditions and events that they celebrate? And you probably will have a lot of different ones going on, depending on cultures, depending on religions. I know I know now the World Cup is happening, like Christmas time, and there's some chat about, do we just do that and show that, or do we do our Christmas carols? What do we do? But where are these people going to be, really? Where are they going to want to go? What are they going to want to celebrate? And what kind of things do people there value? What's important to them? It may be something different to what you value and what you think is important. And then something that I want you to think about now, thinking about the rhythms, is what do people get up to? Where are they going and what are they doing there? How do they spend their time? I'll just give you a couple minutes to think about that. And again, if you don't know, how can you find out? Where do the young people go after school? Where's their safe place? What do parents do during the day? I've been sharing my home with a family for the past year, and it's been a delight. And I've been quite surprised because I've lived in community with people, but actually living in the same house with people brings a whole different perspective, because I work from home as well, so every day I knew what my housemate was up to. And she went shopping all the time. Like, that is just what she does for fun. I hate shopping. So that was a real surprise to me. You might be surprised where you'll find people. And finally, where's God involved already? What's he doing? Surely we can't be so arrogant to think that God wasn't here before we came, before we showed up. I'm the bringer of the good news, and only me. It's such a joy when you hear about the history of a place and you find out the 10s and 20 and 30 years of prayer that has gone into preparing the way for the ministry you get to join in when you show up. Where's God at work? Who are the people of peace? They're not necessarily the gatekeepers. Sometimes the gatekeepers won't be the people of peace, and it'll be really frustrating. But who are the people that have kingdom values that you can really relate with, and you even think, are you a Christian? There's something about you. Who is close to the kingdom? And who are the Christians that already live there? They may not go to church locally, but there's probably some that you can root out. Can you join together to pray for that place? Can you help them get a vision for their local community? And here's a challenging one. Who is already proclaiming the kingdom? Who's bringing a taste of the kingdom, even if they're not Christians? And that's really hard. Because in my community, I've been there 2 years, it's been in a pandemic, and before I came, there was lots of prayer happening, there was good things happening, and that all stopped whilst I was there. But the people bringing a taste of the kingdom, there's a guy called John the legend, and he's really well known on the estate, and he invested in putting together the best fairy trail ever. Like, if you come to Cornwall, come to my estate and have a look at our fairy trail. It is beautiful. It is an oasis on a council estate, and it's getting families out to enjoy God's creation. He is someone I want to work with, but the church isn't there. But John's there. And there's a council worker there, and as I shared my heart, he was like, I'm so passionate that young people here see opportunities that they experience more than I did growing up here. He's got a heart, he's got a shared heart with me. Who are those people proclaiming the kingdom? What can you get involved in? Where is God already at work? I'll just give you a few minutes to think about that. And as you're thinking about these things, can I add a question? What is God saying to you? What is he prompting in you that might be a little bit uncomfortable and might be costly? These are just a few other resources that we would recommend. I'd advise you check them out. You can just Google these. There's the Umoja Community Engagement Resource by Tear Fund. This is a really great pack of Bible studies, of activities that you take a team through to engage with their community and do community mapping. There's also a table resource, which is all around the idea of getting the community around a table together for food and chat. And these can be Christians and non-Christians saying, what could our community be like? What does the Bible say? What great opportunities for evangelism and discipleship to involve non-Christians in developing a picture for where they live and looking at the Bible together. And we also do some community mapping resources at Innovista. And as I said, we help churches to better understand their communities and think about the opportunities and the challenges from mission where they are. So do check those out. I'm just going to hand over to Josh for our conclusions.
I'm going to offer two hopefully quite safe conclusions that you'll be convinced by, and then perhaps offer a slightly grittier one. Firstly, in hyper-local communities, careful exploration of place, people, and culture is needed in order to share the gospel of the kingdom. You need to share the gospel using the experience and the reference points of the people that you're working with. This is especially true for young people who have an even smaller world and pool of experience to draw upon. Secondly, the characteristics of effective mission to working class communities are different than models of church that are centered probably on the one hand on gatherings and course-based discipleship, and on the other on models of compassion ministry and missional leadership that work for and not with communities. And we're seeing this in lots of our work within Innovista, that there is beautiful gospel work going, but it's got to look maybe a little bit different, and we've got to have a different toolkit to address some of these things. And hopefully we've given you some pointers and some direction on that today. But thirdly, obviously in Innovista we have a bias. We are for growing churches in under-reached and under-resourced communities. And Gemma shared that beautiful eschatological picture of all classes and nations and cultures and backgrounds coming together. But the challenge sometimes when we share that big picture is we lose a bit of agency. We think, well, if God's going to reach everyone, I'm going to reach the monkeys like me. Or we think, if God's going to reach everyone, then at some point in the future, that is what's going to happen, and he's going to bring everyone in, and we lose a bit of agency and personal calling in that. If we want to grow multi-class churches, I think perhaps we need to correct a bias that we have. I think the same tools of contextual ministry and asset-based community development can work actually across social groups. But I do think that perhaps some of the dominant patterns that we currently have for ministry and mission, particularly amongst children and young people, are going to struggle to fully express the gospel to certain communities and cultures. And if we really do want to be multi-class and reach everyone, I think we might have to correct that bias by tipping it a different way in order that we might reach more people. So just wherever you are now, those of us online, those of us in the room, I just want to ask a simple question for reflection, and maybe you can write it down or jot it in your phone. What was most important for you today? Perhaps if you're comfortable, you might want to ask that question prayerfully and see what God, through his Spirit, might surface, where he might nudge you. What was most important for you today? Father, I pray a prayer of blessing on every single person who's gathered today. There are some of us who may have recognized our experience in the stories and challenges that we've heard. There are some of us that probably feel motivated and excited right now, and some of us that may be actually feeling a little bit unsure or perhaps even guilty. God, I pray that whatever we are carrying in our heart right now, you would remind us that this is your mission that we are joining in with. And that you have prepared a place and a purpose for us in that mission, in joining with you. And just as those disciples returned to Jesus and were affirmed and celebrated, may we also be called once again as daughters and sons, as brothers and sisters, affirmed in our desire to serve you and to join in with your mission to all people in all places. Amen.